There we are. And I need to do that. Got it. All right, we'll just give it, I'll just give it a minute for others to log in, either through YouTube or through Zoom, and then we will get down to work. I hope that everybody has had a very good Yamim Noraim, the high holiday season. I hope that everybody is doing well now here in 5783 in our new year. And I hope everybody is ready to begin the process of learning some more Torah. We will be starting in Genesis because that is Bereishit, but we're going to start also in, well, kind of chapter 1, although we're going to focus on the very first part of chapter 2. Now is as good a time as any to remind people that when we studied from Torah, that the chapter headings are not intrinsic within the Torah itself. The Torah did not come with chapter or verse numbers. The verses themselves are broken down according to trope in a very particular way and have been for a very long time, but chapter numbers were added quite a bit later by non-Jewish scholars. And as such, there are some points of disagreement between our traditions and the non-Jewish traditions. Most notably, the very beginning of chapter 2, under Jewish considerations, really is considered to be the completion of chapter 1. And we'll talk about how that first few verses of chapter 2 are most appropriate as part of chapter 1, as part of our discussion today. But it does mean that sometimes it'll look a little strange that we are straddling chapters. Just remember that we are straddling an artificial gap that was added by non-Jewish scholars. And while it is a convenient numbering system, making it much easier to reference particular parts of Tanakh, of the Bible, we should not take these as being set in stone or as divinely mandated. They are of earthly and, as I've said now repeatedly, non-Jewish construction, and therefore easily overlooked when necessary, because they have no intrinsic value other than convenience. And when they are not convenient, ignore them. All right, I think that is a fine little introduction, and given time for people to get back in the habit of logging in, a reminder to those who are joining late and watching the makeup recording on YouTube, I do try to start on time for the flow of the class to make sure there is always enough time, but also as a sign of respect for those who have made the effort to be here on time, as well as for those that may have a limited lunchtime break and want to study as much as possible. So I will shorten the delay as we go and try to start as close to 12 as possible. So we are in chapter 1 of the book of Bereishit, and as we're going to see, there is so much to say and never enough time to say it. Even if we studied this for 7 days, we still wouldn't have enough time to cover everything that we need. So we're going to take a slice and take a look at it. But we can't really understand the slice that we're going to focus on, which is the start of chapter 2, without getting at least a hint of the end of chapter 1, of the end of the 6 days of active creation. So we're going to begin with verse 29 to give us at least a taste. I hope that you are familiar with the rest of chapter 1. If you were there to enjoy Simchat Torah, you would, of course, have heard all of this. And if you missed it, then please come on Shabbat, either to my congregation or any other congregation, and be able to catch up with the reading there. But as always, you should be reading the entire parasha privately every week as well. And God said, now addressing the humans that he had created at the very beginning, here I give you, and Everett Fox very conveniently points out underneath his asterisk that it is natati lachem, that it is the plural address that is done here, meaning God is speaking both to Adam and Chava, as we will later know them, Adam and Eve, for indeed they were both created at this time. And although we see a later discussion in chapter 2 of the taking from Adam to make Chava story, it's important to recognize that in the broadest sense, they were both created together. all plants seeding forth seeds that are upon the face of all the earth, and all trees in which there is tree fruit seeding from forth seeds, for you shall they be for eating. And also for all the living things of the earth, for all the birds of the heavens, and all crawling about on earth in which there is living being, all green plants for eating. It was so. So we get this tail end of the discussion of the creation of humanity, where God has made us to exist, making us B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, something we've discussed before, and now giving us instructions that we are to settle and to enjoy the land and to eat. And indeed, there are some who argue from these verses that the primordial nature of our creation was to be vegetarian, to only eat from the plants and vegetables that were there. And indeed, some could argue that this was even meant to be vegan. And then it was only later, after the story of Noah, that we are given more of a permission to be omnivores. That's a whole nother conversation and discussion. I will say that I am an omnivore. I am not vegetarian or vegan, but it is an interesting discussion for another time. Having given us our instructions for what we are to eat, it continues on. And God saw all that he had made, and here it was exceedingly good. There was setting, there was dawning, the sixth day. So here we see at the end of the sixth day, the end of the last day of active creation, that God is reflecting and examining upon all of the things that he has made, which indeed is parallel to the activities of all the other 5 days. And God comes to a conclusion which is a little different from all of the other 5 days, that we have Tov Me'od as opposed to Tov, that it is very good or exceedingly good in Everett Fox's translation, rather than merely good, that there is something cumulative about the sum of its parts, or indeed that perhaps the world was only made very good with the introduction of the ensouled humanity, the Adam and Chava that would be on the face of the earth and have a special role within it, not merely being creations, but being in the image of God, that special admixture, that leavening, that catalyst agent that is humanity, made the world very good, as opposed to the goodness in and of itself, a topic that we will come back to in just a while, of our relationship to the whole nature of creation itself and the purpose of creation. Before we press on into verse 1 of chapter 2, which again is really a continuation of the theme, are there any questions? Just give it a second for YouTube to catch up. All right, I'm not seeing any typed questions. I'm not seeing anybody unmuting themselves on Zoom. So let's continue in chapter 2. Thus were finished the heavens and the earth with all of their array. God had finished on the seventh day his work that he had made, and then he ceased on the seventh day from all his work that he had made. God made the seventh day his blessing, and he hallowed it, for on this day he ceased from all his work that by creating God had made. Now, you may be noticing that even with Everett Fox's translation and its attempt at the capturing of the poetry of the Hebrew, that it feels a little uneven or clunky. And that is absolutely true. This paragraph, these 3 sentences known collectively as Vayechulu, based after the first word of the first line, are very familiar to all of us, as we'll talk about in the commentary, but oftentimes we don't take the time to reflect and unpack the meaning that is contained within them. And that is something that we're going to spend a little bit more time on. But in order to do so, as always, we need to notice some of the unevenness, some of the areas that seem to be drawing our attention or piquing our interest or perhaps confusing us. As always, those are openings to interpretation and understanding. As the famous commentary by Rashi will often refer to them as darsheni moments, where the text itself is screaming out, I need to be inquired of. I need to be understood more deeply than a pure surface reading. So some of the things that stand out here, beginning in chapter 2, beginning in verse 2, is the idea that it says by Yom HaShvi'i that God finished his work on the seventh day. But that doesn't seem to match, because surely all of the work of creation, the melachto, his labor, was finished b'yom hashishi, on the sixth day. So how can we be saying that he finished on the seventh day if indeed the work was completed on the sixth day? Was there more work on the seventh day that is unstated? Is there something that we missed? Is this a linguistic idiom that we are not as comfortable with? Those are questions that will need to be answered. And then to go on to say, Vayishbot, and he ceased. By the way, this root Vayishbot, the Shin Bet Taf, is the root for the word Shabbat, the word for Sabbath in and of itself, meaning to cease. Or indeed, you can even argue go on strike in some of the modern usages of the verb, that there was a work stoppage on day number 7. But again, how can it be a stoppage on the day if there hadn't been work already being done on the day? Or is this merely contrasting day number 7 to the other 6 days that we have listed from chapter 1? And then we go on again to reemphasize on this, that from he is stopping, he is ceasing from all of the work that he had made. And that is then doubled up in verse number 3 in a way that both reinforces but also confuses. The first part is quite straightforward, that God blessed the seventh day, and he made it holy. He made it hallowed. He made it a day of distinction. And then we get the explanation, because indeed it was on that seventh day that he shavat mikol malachto, that he ceased from all of his work. He took a break from all of his work. And then the last 4 words, again, grammatically become a little confusing. Asher bara Elohim la'asot, that by creating God had made, that God had created to make. It's almost like it could have said Asher bara Elohim, that God had been creating, or the another version of the word la'asot, for example, asa, like we saw back in verse number 2, but with the infinitive la'asot, this grammar of the end of verse 3 becomes a little uneven for our easy interpretation or reading. Again, as I have mentioned many, many times before, but maybe you're only just joining me now for Bereishit Forward, saying that something is uneven or stands out or incongruous doesn't mean that it is flawed. Far from it. It means that these are the points within the text that are leaping up in front of us, that God deliberately wrote in ways that we're not going to simply slip into our mind without further examination, in order that we would stop, scratch our face, wonder what's going on, and ask questions that will lead to more insights and deeper understanding than just saying, on the seventh day, God didn't do any more work, and pretending like we have somehow comprehended all of the mysteries that come from the acts of creation. No, these are deliberate inflection points that are designed to draw our attention. These are the so-called flaws that are there to make us reflect upon the fuller understanding of perfection. It is the roughness that catches our attention and forces us to truly engage with the deep texture of the text itself. All right. Before we get into our commentary, as always, I'll give a quick break in case anyone has a question that they would like to ask or share. Not seeing anything pop up in Zoom or YouTube, so let's go ahead. All right. So, as I mentioned, this paragraph, the beginning of chapter 2, the first 3 verses, is quite famous within the Jewish liturgy, the Jewish ritual practice. As Rambam explains here in Mishnah Torah, what is the procedure he should follow? Meaning somebody on Friday night he should take a cup that contains a revi'it or more, that is to say, a couple ounces worth of wine. He should fill it with wine, hold it in his right hand, lifting it above the ground more than a handbreadth, meaning you actually raise the glass. And one recites the blessing Hagafen, meaning the Borei Pri Hagafen, the blessing over the fruit of the vine. And then the Kiddush, the extended paragraph, which remarks upon the sanctification of Shabbat as being both a memorial for the exodus from Egypt, as well as a remembrance of the act of creation. So we have those two themes in the Kiddush, and therefore it is not surprising that it is, however, common custom among the Jewish people first to recite the passage Vayachulu, then the blessing Hagafen, and then the Kiddush. That indeed this is the common practice in every Jewish community that I am aware of, that before we leap in to do the Borei Pri Hagafen and to do the Kiddush, we will recite the Vayachulu, that we will say this paragraph, those three verses from chapter 2, and then launch into the actual statement. Now, we're going to have to come back then and wrestle with the question of what is so special about Vayachulu then that we are reciting it, in fact, multiple times over the course of Shabbat. Is it just because it is talking about the sanctification of Shabbat? Well, yes, that certainly is a big portion of it. But remember that the Kiddush itself and Shabbat itself is given not only as a reminder of creation, but is also a reminder of the exodus from Egypt. Surely, if we were going to recite passages in honor of Shabbat, we wouldn't recite only one of them if that was our sole intention for choosing passages. We would want to also recite a passage that described the blessing of Shabbat as a remembrance of the Exodus. But that is not the custom that is practiced. Instead, it is the Vayachulu alone that stands as an introductory reflection before we get to the blessing over the wine and the Kiddush for the day itself. So there's something special happening in Vayachulu that is unique, that creates a special moment of meditation, of reflection, of gathering our kavanah and an intention to then proceed for our entry point into Shabbat. And that's what's going to be our focus. So let's take a look at what the Talmud says about this practice, or at least a little bit about what it says. Rav Hamnumna said, anyone who prays on Shabbat evening and recites the passage of Vayachulu, the verse ascribed him as if he became a partner with the Holy One, blessed be he, in the act of creation. All right, it's a bold statement, and we'll come back to what it means in a second. But first, we have to see how he can make that claim, that simply by saying Vayachulu, this paragraph, that we are given the same credit as though we were standing alongside the Holy One as the world was being created and helped in that endeavor. What is his proof? As it is stated, we're finished, Vayachulu, our opening phrase from chapter 2, but do not read it as we're finished, Vayachulu, meaning don't read those consonants with that particular collection of vowels. Instead, read it as they finished, Vaychalu, right, which is the same consonants, but with a different vocalization. If you are unfamiliar with Hebrew or of this particular technique in rabbinic midrash, let me just explain by going back to the actual text that the way the consonants, which are the main letters you see here, are arranged is often very standard, but the vowels, the extra dots in many cases that are around the letters, those are not written in the original text of the Torah. Hebrew includes the vowels now as a convenience and as a accuracy measure to make sure that the text is vocalized correctly in all ways, because sometimes without the vowels on the page, it would be absolutely possible to read the same consonants with new vowels and have a different meaning. And here that is what the rabbi is using as his launching point for his interpretation, that we can reread Vayachulu to mean not they were finished, but instead they finished, turning it from being a passive voice into an active voice. And by turning it into that plural, we are then forced to say, well, who are they? Who is the they that are involved for creation? Very simply, says Rav Hamnuna, it is the rest of us. That if we reflect on creation while reciting the paragraph of Vayahulu, then we are acting as partners with God in creation. Now, how does that work? Well, it's based on the number of other things we have to remember. One of them, of course, is that we were made B'Tselem Elohim. We were made in the image of God, and thus it is not our body that is reflective of God's image, for God has no body. It is our essence that is reflective of God's image, and the essence in this particular case that is being emphasized is the essence of one that creates. And how do we know that humanity has a special role in the creation, the moving of the world forward? Well, like we discussed in the very first few minutes of our class today, the fact that it is only after the creation of humanity that are specially tasked with having a role in the settling and shaping of creation, that creation receives the final title of Tov Me'od, of being very good. That there is something that is added to creation more than just our presence when we are created, but is instead a certain vitality and directionality that makes creation indeed have a purpose, makes creation have a direction. And that is what Rav Hamnuna is really going for here, is that when we remember that, when we think of this, and when we honor the act of creation with this in mind by the recitation of Vayahulu, then we are indeed joining with God for creation. Additionally, there's a lot to unpack here. When we actually observe Shabbat, when we recognize the sanctity of day number 7, when we recognize it's sanctified because God refrained from his work, and we recognize, and when we honor that by refraining from our work, then indeed we are deliberately and directly imitating the actions of God. We cannot create the universe the way God did. We cannot create the planets the way God did. We can't even create fish the way God did. But we can create cessation. We can create the stoppage of the work the way God did. And in that way, we join God. I know it may seem a little presumptuous to imagine that we are partners with God in creation because we are joining him during his break, but it is precisely because the break is part of creation that by recognizing God's command to rest on this day, that we are in fact testifying that we accept the entirety of creation, both break and the rest of the actions, as being divine. And that creates a partnership between us and God. So yes, there is a lot going on in this paragraph of Vayahulu, and there is a lot going on in our observance of Shabbat and our recognition of its place. And this is, of course, one of the reasons why I argue that these first 3 lines of chapter 2 really are the epilogue of chapter 1, rather than being a separate text. All right, that was a long bit of explanation. I'll just pause and see if there's any questions on that point. All right, so let's finish off the Talmud's discussion of this because, well, it's rather interesting. Rabbi Elazar said, from where is it derived that speech is like action? The idea that in Judaism, when we talk, we are actually doing something, that it is maybe not as obvious as picking something up with your hand, but it is still nonetheless a significant action. As it is stated, by the word of God, the heavens were made, and all of their hosts by the breath of his mouth. A set passage from Psalms, which of course is echoed throughout the first 6 days of active creation, where constantly we see God said, God said, God said, and things come into being. God's speech is like action, thus we should treat our speech like action. When someone ever says, oh, I was just joking, or I said it, but I didn't mean it, or you shouldn't take my word seriously, they are missing the entire point, that you need to treat your speech the same way you treat your actions with your arms, feet, or anything else. Rav Chisda said, Mar Ukva said, one who prays on Shabbat evening and recites Vayahulu the two ministering angels who accompany the person at all times place their hands on his head and say to him, and your iniquity has passed and your sin has been atoned. So this paragraph of Vayachulu is reflected upon by Mar Ukva as being so primary, as being so essential to our understanding of God and all of the purpose of creation, that if a person recites it on Shabbat, if they recognize their proper relationship to this moment of Shabbat and through it to the rest of creation, then indeed they are in a state of perfection, that whatever transgressions they may have committed are of course forgiven, because they are standing in the place they are meant to stand, in that perfect relationship to God, through our understanding of our place in creation. Any questions before we move on for a slightly different take from the Rishalmi? Going to get a little bit more metaphysical, so I hope everyone is okay with that. Okay, so Yerushalmi, which is often translated as the Jerusalem Talmud. This is the earlier version of the Talmud that was completed in the land of Israel before the Babylonian Talmud was completed later on. The Babylonian is considered more definitive when it comes to Jewish law, simply because it had more time for analysis and debate and discussion. But when it comes to other interpretations, what's often called the Agadah, the philosophical reflections, the insights in both of the Talmuds as well as other rabbinic literature are always cherished. Rabbi Yochanan said, usually when someone stretches the ropes of a tent, in time, the ropes will loosen. But here, taken from Isaiah 40, he stretched them like a tent to sit in. And it said in Job 37, they are strong. Now, what are we talking about here? Well, we're taking the verses from Isaiah and Job, and we are applying them as they seem to be in context to the act of creation, that God stretched out the heavens. And one would normally think that if you are stretching them out, well, over time, they're going to get slack. Just like the ropes of a tent will eventually lose their elasticity, their tension. So too, you would imagine that the heavens above, the firmament in the archaic English, would eventually sag. However, in Job, it reminds us that they are strong. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, usually if someone casts a vessel, in time it will rust. But here, like a cast mirror, again from Job, it's reminding us that there is something stronger. All the time, they look like newly cast. So what Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Reish Lakish, are trying to remark upon here is a concern that was not uncommon in the world of their day, and indeed is a concern that is still perhaps fixated upon by many, which is that creation will eventually wear out, that, everything made will eventually deteriorate. Everything that exists will eventually not exist. That seems to be our intuition. No matter what I make, whether it be my house, my tent, or even just a pot, eventually it's going to fall apart. Maybe not in my lifetime if I make it very, very well, but in my children or my grandchildren or great-grandchildren, certainly, eventually everything that is made of matter will eventually fall apart. But in this juxtaposition of the verses from Isaiah and from Job, the rabbis are trying to remind us that God's creation is different than our creation, that the creation of the universe is not going to fall apart. And indeed, as far as current scientific investigation says, while it might be the case that the universe as we relate to it with the sun, the moon, and the stars will eventually break down and transform into different types of matter and energy, the matter and energy of the universe will never be extinguished. That our particular arrangements of it, the things that we gather together and make, may fall apart, but the actual elements of the universe are enduring and timeless. I may be able to scrape together mud to make a brick, and that brick will eventually fall apart, but the elements that are behind the mud are eternal in all of their constituent pieces till the end of time, which, as near as we can tell at the moment, has no end. The sky and the earth and all their host were completed. God finished on the seventh day, and God blessed the seventh day. A summation of our Vayahulu. Now, what is written after that? What verse comes after those first three? These are the generations of the skies, or of the heavens. If we flip back to our text here, you can see Ele Todot HaShamayim v'Haaretz. These are the begettings, these are the lineage, this is the generations of the heavens and the earth. What has one to do with the other? Right? How does this work? Only that a day comes and goes, a week comes and goes, a month comes and goes, a year comes and goes. As it is written from the verse, these are the generations of the skies and the earth when they were created, on the day that the eternal God created heaven and earth. What is being answered here is an unspoken question, but one that would have been more commonly discussed at the time that the Midrash was being shared, that if we talk about the generations of Abraham, if we talk about the generations of Jacob, if we talk about the generations of any other people, there are discussions of things being born and dying. When we talk about the life of Abraham, there is a beginning and there's an end. And yes, he is then replaced by Isaac, but Isaac too will die. When we talk about the generations of any lineage, and it is a common phrase used especially in Genesis, but in other parts of the Bible as well, it is always a talking of coming and going, coming and going. And what is being discussed here by Rabbi Elazar is that, Rabbi Azaria here is trying to tell us that this is not the same kind of coming and going as the coming and going of flesh and blood, that we shouldn't think of the all of creation as coming and going. It's not that all of creation is going to wink out of existence, but instead the coming and going, the generations of the heaven and earth, is merely the revolution of time as marked by the orbiting of our planet and by the turning of our planet on its axis. So we shouldn't be concerned that the generations of heaven and earth implies a imminent destruction of heaven and earth, but instead is just talking about the normal cycle of day and night and all of the other ways that we mark the passage of time. So you need not be overly concerned with the dissolution of creation. When God made the world, he made it so that it would endure. From a more recent halachic work, Peninei Halacha, it took 6 days for God to create the heavens, the earth, and all within them. At first glance, an additional day seems unnecessary. Nevertheless, God created the seventh day and designated it for rest and cessation of labor. As a result, the world contains rest, blessing, and holiness. Thus we read, the heaven and the earth were finished and all their array. On the seventh day, God finished the work that he had been doing, and he ceased on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because on it, God ceased from all the work of creation that he had done. So this is a slightly more smoother translation in order to emphasize the point that he is trying to make, which is that the act of creating day number 7 was in fact an act of creation, thus solving our question of how could God cease from creation on the seventh day if he hadn't been creating on the seventh day? And the answer is, well, he did create the seventh day, and that was what he then ceased from, but there was no other work being done. That transition from day 6 to day 7 was indeed another act of creation, for God wanted to create one more day, but that day was specifically created in order to be empty of labor, to not have melacha. That without it, it would be an uninterrupted cycle of 6 days, followed by 6 days, followed by 6 days of nothing but labor and work. That God needed to create a moment of emptiness in order for there to be the concept of emptiness. That God had to create a moment where God rested in order that we would have the concept of rest. And of course, God had to create a vessel to contain that concept of holiness, without which we might not have had the concept of holiness. So there was creation to create the day number 7, but it was specifically created so that we would stop our labors on all subsequent Shabbats going forward. I know that's a little bit sort of back to front, but really there are many things in life where we must do the same, where we have to make space in order to have space, that there is an act of effort in order to have a time of no effort. Indeed, anyone who's ever prepared for Shabbat knows that Thursday and Friday before Shabbat begins can often have extra work involved in order that when Shabbat comes around, there is no work during that period. If anybody is ever felt themselves very busy before going on vacation in order to get their work done so that their job will be able to be maintained in their absence, you'll have another feeling for that as well. Sometimes just going through the steps of turning off all of your devices, ringers, notifications in order that you could have a nap will give you a reminder that sometimes there is a modicum of labor in order to be free of labor for a period. And while we may take that 7th day and the idea of cessation for granted, recognize that it is a created concept and one that we are deeply indebted to God for having created, having taken the time to make time so that we would have time. With that somewhat in mind, we're turning to Keddushat Levi, a more Kabbalistic interpretation from the Hasidic tradition. Heaven and earth and all their components were completed, for on that day, God had ceased from all his work that he had created to be continued or to complete it. So again, you can see here in the translation, trying to emphasize the awkwardness of that verse as we discussed. And I apologize for not getting rid of that apostrophe D. Anyone who knows me knows that there was absolutely no reason to put apostrophe dashes or any other changes to the English word God. If you'd like to know more about that, contact me and I'll be happy to explain. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak understood the words Hashamayim v'ha'aretz, the heavens and the earth, as referring to the sum total of the tangible universe, reminding us that our sacred texts teach us that prior to the creation of the universe, there was only what is known in Kabbalistic parlance as Ein Sof, God as an infinite, without end, literally, a concept that is beyond our capacity to understand. The story of creation conveys how, through the creation of the universe as we know it, this infinite became transformed into something finite, both in space and in time. So through Vayahulu, we are being reminded, first of all, of the totality of all of creation, but through the recognition of the totality of all of creation, we are also being reminded that prior to the physicality of creation, there was an infinitude of God as Ein Sof, without end, that all that was God, for there was nothing but God. God had to create space in order that there could be this material, physical creation that we are a part of and that we interact with. And this is a concept that really defies human understanding. Certainly the concept of God as God and only existing as God without any creation is already difficult enough for us to understand, for that was a time that was without time, for time had not been created yet either. But that recognition that God's act of creation had to create space for creation is a beautiful parallel to the whole concept of Shabbat as well, that God had to make room among God's infinity in order for there to be the finite of creation itself, the material objects of which there is a limited value in all of existence. And that didn't leave you scratching, I don't know what will, but it is something to hold on to as we reflect each week as we recite Vayechulu, and we are grateful for Shabbat and through Shabbat all of creation. As I try to remind people on multiple occasions, whenever we are saying prayers or passages in particular times or ways, whenever we are following Jewish ritual, there is more to it than just doing the words or even thinking about those particular words with their surface meanings. We should be trying to draw together all the different convergence of interpretations and meanings in order to see in it a refraction of wisdom in multiple directions. With that in mind, as we turn to Bereishit Rabbah, and God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good, very good being the ending of chapter 1. Rabbi Levi began, meaning begins his interpretation from Proverbs. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, and the glory of a king to explicate a matter. Rabbi Levi said in the name of Rabbi Hama bar Hanina, from the beginning of the book to this point is divine glory, a concealed matter. From this point on is king's glory, explicated matter. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that the true essence of all of the passages up to it was very good, Tov Me'od, the end of chapter 1, really we should recognize that this is concealed. This is hidden from a full understanding by humanity. People who treat the first 6 days of creation as though they were a simple child's fairy tale, which usually tend to be people that are most adamant that they are religious or most adamant that they're not religious, and both get it wrong, is really misunderstanding this text, that our tradition has always accepted that there is a deep, abiding, and impenetrable layer of mystery to the first 6 days of creation, and one that, while we may wish to plumb its depths to the limits of our understanding, we must always have the humility to recognize the limits to our understanding. From this point forward, meaning the beginning of what we would call chapter 2, there are explicated matters. Now, this is going to be examined a little bit more. The glory of the words of Torah, which are compared to kings, as it says in Proverbs, through me, wisdom, king, through me, meaning through wisdom, kings reign, are explicated matters. So the idea being that the words of Torah that come after this are the words that we actually base our activities on, base our life upon. These are the essence of the wisdom that makes it possible for there to be society, civilization, and indeed a good and meaningful life for every individual. And so it is no surprise then that they would say that the initialization of Shabbat would be part of that wisdom that we absolutely can explicate and understand and live with. The details, the underlying mysteries of the 6 days that preceded it, those are not foundations upon which for us to build actual behaviors or policies or laws. It is there to inspire and be reflected upon, to seek spiritual enlightenment from, but it is not the same type of wisdom that is used for the actual governance of ourselves or our society. Alternately, because there's always more than one interpretation, so going to a different interpretation altogether, and God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Rabbi Tanhuma began, taking from Ecclesiastes, he brings everything to pass precisely at its time. Rabbi Tanhuma said, the world was created at its time. The world was not appropriate for creation before this. What does it mean by it was very good? It means now it is very good. This is the precise moment when its goodness can be me'od, and thus this is the moment of creation. Rabbi Abahu said, slightly different interpretation, from this we learn that the Holy Blessed One was creating worlds and destroying them, until he created these. That there were multiple universes prior to this, he said, this is good for me, those are not good for me. How does he get that idea that this was the good one and the other ones were flawed? Rabbi Pinchas explained Rabbi Abahu's reasoning. And God saw all that he had made, kol, right, which is a all-inclusive description of the entirety, a plural, the plurality of creation. And behold, it was very good. It is then rendered in a singular form in the text, meaning this particular creation is good for me. Those, meaning all of the other creations, are not good for me. Now, as we already reflected, it is not required that a person ascribe to one interpretation or another. These are things to meditate upon and to allow us to reach more deeply into some of the spiritual underpinnings of our beliefs, but they are not meant to be in competition or something that we should be agitated or in conflict over. But the underlying idea would be that this world has something unique about it that makes it the very good version of creation. And that something unique about it is not necessarily because it has the best temperature or because it has the prettiest birds or the tastiest fruit, that there is something intrinsic to it that lends itself to being an enduring place of creation. That can be debated in many, many different ways, but just to reflect upon what it might be that you find in this world that is of lasting value in creation, and that without it, creation would be flawed, imperfect, and not enduring, is something that is a good personal meditation. And let us just turn to our last text, also from Bereishit Rabbah. What did the world lack? Meaning, what was it that compelled God to create a day number 7 after he had made everything up to day number 6, and it was tov me'od, it was very good up to that point? Rest. The Sabbath came, rest came, and the work was thus finished and completed. So what the commentary here in Bereishit Rabbah is trying to tell us is that the world was not truly done until the cessation was actually created. The act of Shabbat was the capstone of creation, not an afterthought, not merely the absence. Indeed, in many other places, our tradition says Shabbat was in mind before creation began, that there had to be creation for there to be cessation, for there to be Shabbat, but that it was only so that we could experience Shabbat that creation was actually needed. For without a material, active world, the idea of spiritual rest would not be possible. This notion that Shabbat and rest are not an afterthought, a new chapter, but they are in fact the increase beyond the tov me'od, the very good of the material of creation, is a very important one to bear in mind. That when we celebrate Shabbat, we are not just celebrating taking a long break, but we are celebrating something that made all of the work that we do actually have purpose and measure, that without it, it would be an undifferentiated, continual chain of events with no purpose, no direction, and no sense of spiritual meaning. Shabbat comes, rest comes, and then creation is completed. You will note that as we go back to our text just for the last time, that the world was made, and tov me'od, it was very good. But when Shabbat is made, then vayikadesh oto, vayikadesh oto, it is sanctified, it is made holy. And vayvarech, God blesses this day. That the 7th day is receiving a measure of blessing and receiving a measure of holiness that the other 6 days did not have. That this far surpasses the rather meager adjective of very good to reflect a higher state of being, a higher state of existence. And as many people continue to fall into the trap of being obsessed or overly focused on the material levels of creation, rather than our spiritual reflections about our journey through the realm of creation, recognizing that it is not the 6 days that receive the highest praise of blessing and sanctity, but it is the seventh day when we are able to rest and reflect upon life that receives those titles, should really show you that although it may be only 1/7 of our time, it is still something that deserves the bulk of our attention. And the bulk of our passion should come through experiencing life that through the lens that Shabbat gives us. So yes, this is a lot that is packed into a mere 3 verses. And there is a reason why those 3 verses have been repeated so many times and captivated so much attention throughout our teachings and history. Any questions or comments before we wrap up for today? All right. Well, thank you all for joining me again. It is good to be rebooting our discussion of the Torah once again, and I hope to see you all again next week and going forward. And if you know of other people that have fallen out of the pattern of joining in, nudge them, get them to log in, have them come back for a little bit of study. And I will see you all next time. A reminder that my other classes have also resumed. So Mishnah, again, will be on Wednesdays at 7 o'clock. And starting on Thursday nights at 6 in November, I'll also be doing a special 5-week class on chanting for the Torah. So please RSVP for that one so I can make sure you get the materials, though. Take care, everyone, and be well.